Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Playing with Power podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things CEDH, EDH, and Magic the Gathering. I'm your host, Ryan.
And I'm your host, TK, and today we are going to be continuing our CEDH Through the Ages series. We're going all the way back to the Four Horsemen set, but before we get into those top cards, we are going to go all the way back to our sponsors. Our merchandise is now available in our store. We have dice, coins, playmats, tokens, sleeves, and more all available. Go to playingwithpowermtg.com and help support the channel. You can also support us on Patreon. Patrons get access to all sorts of things, including our Discord, Webcam League, Playdays, early access to videos, names in the credits of our shows, exclusive videos, merch, and the ability to be on an episode. Our brand new Mox Emerald tier is sure to get you access to everything you'd want and need. And even if that tier isn't for you, there are tiers for everyone. So go to patreon.com/playingwithpowermtg and help support the show. If you're looking to sponsor the podcast, please reach out in the email below. And every episode, we do a Patreon shout-out, and today's Patreon shout-out is none other than Alana's cousin, Julie Tremblay. Yay!
Yay! Thank you, Julie. We don't know if that's Alana's cousin, but today it is.
Today
so, congratulations.
Thank you so
Not
much.
only are you our Patreon shout-out, you are also Alana's cousin. So congratulations.
Yay, family!
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go ahead and dive into our topic today, which is CEDH Through the Ages. This series is where we basically talk about how those sets over time, and basically we talk about the sets over time, and what we do is we see what CEDH cards that were originally printed in those sets we still see today. Some cards we see a lot of, some sets have a big impact on CEDH, and some have none. There are no cards that we see in CEDH. And so we're slowly going over the different sets through the ages. We originally did our first one, which was Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, and Revised, the very first OG sets. We talked about the different cards that were in there that we still see CEDH play today. And today we are continuing that. We are going over the Four Horsemen sets. Now, what are the Four Horsemen sets, you might ask? Those are the four first expansions that were actually released as expansion sets for Magic the Gathering. These are sets that were including expansion symbols, and they're what we kind of see to this day. Those sets were Arabian Nights, Antiquities, Legends, and the Dark. Those were the Four Horsemen sets. Now, we're also going to be including two extra sets in here just for the sake of posterity, because back then, sets weren't released as part of blocks. You know, we had blocks for a very, very long time. And whenever you would hear people talk about things like the Saga block, or you talk about the Masks block, or you talk about the Invasion block, what they were talking about is a set of three different expansions that kind of had a central story and were all correlated together. They would stay on one plane. They would tell a story that would go over, you know, almost like a story arc across three different blocks. They were usually created as one big block and two little blocks. Later on, they would go big, small, big, or big, small, medium as far as the quantity of cards they'd print. But these four first ones were not part of any block. They were just expansions that were released.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting because they kind of jump around everywhere. We're in Agrabah, we're in Arabian Nights, and now Brothers War is happening, and then now Legends, Elder Dragons. They go all across the place, and it's just because Magic was really trying to find its footing during this time. So that's really interesting to see. But a lot of these cards are cards that we do still see today, which is crazy to me to think that cards from all the way back to 93, 94, when some of these sets were, released, can still be found in decks today consistently. That's just kind of wild.
Yep, I 100% agree. The idea that, these four sets were actually released in 1994, all in 1 year. So that seems very normal by today's standards, but that was not normal back then. It really, really wasn't. So even 4 sets in a year was kind of a lot. And the things that got printed in here, you could tell that at times they were maybe rushing. They didn't quite know what they were doing. They learned some lessons, but they also learned more lessons as they were releasing these sets. There's a lot of really interesting trivia and history, and I'll go over a little bit of that with each set, and then we'll actually talk about what we feel are some of the top cards for CEDH for these different sets. All right. So without further ado, let's dive into our first one, and that is Arabian Nights. This was the very first Magic expansion. This was the very first when it came to a lot of things. Yes, we had ABUR, Alpha Beta Unlimited Revised, but this one was the first one to actually see a lot of the stuff that we see today from a Magic card, not only aesthetic perspective, but some of the mechanic perspective and things like that. Arabian Nights was kind of one of the first. So this was the first Magic expansion, not the first set release. This is an expansion saying, hey, we have these core expansions, we're releasing Magic the Gathering, but this is an additional thing that you get to see. And that becomes so commonplace today, we don't even think of them really as separate products. At one point, they did away with core sets, then they brought them back. And then they kind of said, well, some of these are kind of like your core sets. And it's like pretty crazy how things have changed. But this is the first expansion. It wasn't part of any block because blocks didn't exist back then. This was also the very first set to use an expansion symbol, the scimitar. Is the very first time you'd actually say, hey, this card is the only, you can actually say this is from a different set because you could see the expansion symbol on it. ABUR did not have expansion sets at all. So there was only certain ways for you to be able to tell what the difference between them all were. Some of them was the shape of the cards, like the corners. Some of it was like printing. Some of it was like, just really miscellaneous different things. 78 cards were printed into the set. But there are also 15 commons that were accidentally printed with light and dark mana symbols. This is an error, obviously. So to most collectors, the complete set is actually seen as 93 cards. Classic example of this, and we'll put it on the screen now for those of you who are viewing on YouTube, is Oubliette. It's kind of it's a card that a lot of people have seen and stuff like that. But Oubliette has a light printing and a dark printing. It's exactly the same card, from a functionality standpoint, but a lot of collectors who collect the complete set see that as functionally two separate cards to collect for. Whenever you look on places like TCG Player for these, you'll actually see them listed separately. They're not the same one. You're not going to roll the dice and see which one you get. They're actually listed separately on marketplaces and all that. So for all intents and purposes, even though the set was 78 cards, from a collector's and otherwise perspective, it's considered a 93 card set. This set was originally meant to be its own standalone product. I want to say that one extra time. This was not meant to be played with the core set. This was meant to be played as its own set with its own different card back and everything. They were not meant to be mixed together. This was meant to be its own unique card game experience with the same mechanics and rules of Magic, but as its own thing. It was changed at the last minute. They said, this would be better if we actually made this part of the greater Magic expansions, just like ABU and R were. So the interesting thing about this was that you can actually see the original card back on the original Arabian Nights booster boxes. There is a couple of images walking around online, especially here, or at least recently as the time of this recording, some people holding the Arabian Nights booster box in the case and stuff like that. And it's like a $350,000 box at the time of this recording again. And if you look closely in those pictures, you can see the original backing on the Magic cards that were supposed to be different. There was they were similar, but they weren't the same. They had pink in them and stuff like that. And they had a different kind of text on them and whatnot. It was meant to be its own product, but they changed it at the last minute. And it's wild to think about how different the Magic in that set would have been had it been completely different. Couple of really quick other factoids here, and we'll get into the top. So they originally printed basic lands into this set, and that's because it was supposed to be its own standalone set. You needed lands to be able to function. However, they removed them when they decided to roll it into the actual, just an expansion of Magic the Gathering. All the basic lands were removed except for one mountain accidentally left on the print sheet. There was a mountain that was accidentally left in. And the reason that this is so interesting, or at least interesting for my nerdy self, it's known as the Arabian Nights Mountain. And the Arabian Nights Mountain was basically taking up a rare slot because it was accidentally left on the print sheet. So you'd open your package of Arabian Nights and you're hoping to get an Ali from Cairo or something like that, or some Bazaar of Baghdad or some really cool thing. And in the rare slot was a mountain. And it was just so utterly disappointing to accidentally see that there. Those mountains are worth so much money They are worth hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars for these. These blow Guru Mountains and Guru lands out of the water. They are so expensive. And it's because they weren't supposed to be there. There's no other basic lands in the set. It's just this random mountain. And so that was, I think, a really, really cool part of it. All right. So 2 more quick things about it as well. The first set to introduce lands that do other things besides tap for mana. You can see that in things like Bazaar Baghdad. You play a land and it kind of does it a spell's abilities. This was the first set to actually do that. So that was introduced way, way, way early in Magic's history. And this is also the set that has the introduction of some racially insensitive stuff that ended up having to be banned from everywhere. We don't have to go into all the details of that, but this was one of the sets that actually introduced some of that stuff. So what are your thoughts, TK? There was a lot of information in that. What are you thinking?
I did not know that this was supposed to be its own set. And once you said it, I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense. I think when I think about, just Magic sets in general, we think about planes, we think about all of these different fantastical places. Arabian Nights always stuck out to me as because it's, Kamigawa is not Japan. It takes a lot of inspiration from, that history of the place and, lore and all that jazz, but it's not Japan. It has so many different things. Arabian Nights kind of just is like, a lot of the places that are talked about in these stories and, the 101 Nights,
1001 or something like that.
1001, yeah.
Or maybe that's what it's called, 1001. You only missed it by like 998 or something like that.
There's a lot of nights that were just missed right there. But yeah, it's really just that. And I always thought that was so interesting. I was like, wow, that seems so different. But also, like, from a just trading card game perspective, I can't imagine playing with cards that don't have expansion symbols on them.
Nowadays,
nowadays, just from like every other card game that I think I've played, I know specifically like Pokemon does expansion symbols as well, and that you need kind of that to understand what printing of this card I'm playing with sometimes. And whether it's like little codes that they have on the bottom that tell you, okay, this is the printing from this specific set. I know Yu-Gi-Oh does that, and a lot of other Japanese centered card games do just that, just have the set name printed on it. But yeah, that's really revolutionary to have that kind of be a way to dictate printings between cards. And I don't even know if they were thinking about that beforehand when they did that, because, this is not necessarily something that was reprint heavy. But I think without it, there probably would have been some trouble then. So that's really cool. Yeah. Overall, I think that is crazy. And also, trading card game people are the only people who are going to want to pay millions and millions of dollars for something that was not supposed to happen. Oh, wow, this card has a weird shade of whatever. Now I need it. I need it in my life. We're the only people that do that.
It's so true. It's so true.
Yeah. But
like, this printing is a dark printing. This card's miscut or misprinted, or it's got a roller mark on it or whatever.
Yeah,
it's
like,
crazy.
Yeah, now I need it, like that. And I guess people who do like action figures and stuff like that. But outside of those, we're the only people that are like that, which is really funny. But yeah. Other than that, it's really interesting. Do you want to get into the cards now?
Yeah, let's dive into the cards. So go ahead, kick us off. What were the cards that we see still to this day that was printed all the way back in 1994?
I think the first one is of no surprise to anybody. It's City of Brass. This is one of the lands that you were talking about that does a thing. It literally taps for all mana, any mana available, and color fixing, as we know, is so important, especially now with the 5-color decks, everything else. You need the ability to tap for all of your mana as fast as possible. Otherwise, you get stuck. And if anybody's gotten color stuck in playing a game, it's terrible. It deals the damage. It's functionally, a lot of times, people put that and Mana Confluence in the same slot because it is, or you play both because they do functionally the same thing. But yeah, no surprise there. City of Brass is absolutely the biggest card from the set that still sees play to this day. Yep.
And a lot of play, no
Yeah.
less. This isn't like, oh, here's a little niche card that's in some decks. It's played so much.
Yeah.
It is an unbelievable amount of inclusion that we see today.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really cool, quite frankly, that a land or just a card that was printed in 1994 is played, I don't know, going on 30 years later.
Absolutely.
And we see it all the time.
Yeah. I will, even if I have a 2-color deck that does not need to be color fixed anyway, I'm still putting City of Brass in most of the time just because I don't even want to think about it. It just is a foregone conclusion that I'm going to have the mana that I need at that moment in time. And this is one of those cards that just fixes that just outright by having it. And it's not expensive now either, too. There's so many printings of it now. So if you're ever, even if you're not even playing CEDH, if you're just playing regular casual, this is a card that you can pick up for, cheap mana bases pretty easily as well.
And you could see how ubiquitous it is in all formats simply because of its price tag. This thing has been printed a lot. It has been printed many, many times, and it still commands a price in the double digits. It's always at least like $10 or whatever, if not more, depending on what it is.
Yeah.
Usually hovers between $10 and $20 at any given point in time. It gets printed all the time. Well, not all the time, but it has been printed a lot over the last 30 years, and it still commands that price. So they did a good job, or maybe they did a bad job design-wise. That's why it's so good today. But City of Brass is fantastic.
Absolutely. And the second card that we have here is Bazaar of Baghdad. Now, I got to be honest with you. Never seen this in a game ever, but
oh, really?
Yeah, no.
You didn't play in the year of our Lord when the Gitrog reigned supreme. Okay, all right, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, I did not. I like I said, I've been playing, roughly about 2 years now, give or take, and so it's a card that I've heard about, but it's never been. I've never seen it in fruition in the format that we're speaking of, but it makes sense to me. It does see play, and we're talking about lands that do things. This is definitely one of those ones. Yeah. It's
definitely fallen out of favor. It was ubiquitous. It was kind of like the card that the Gitrog monster used for the most part. Like if you were going to associate something with the Gitrog monster, it would be Dakmor Salvage.
Yeah.
It would be Bazaar of Baghdad, and it would be other garbage cards that Gitrog played. I don't know. But but Bazaar of Baghdad was usually always the last card a Gitrog player would try to acquire when it was building the deck for real in paper. And because it obviously was so expensive, but it was such a powerful card in that deck. The dredge mechanic, the Gitrog's ability, all that kind of stuff was just so unbelievably powerful. And it has fallen out of favor in the last couple of years only because the Gitrog monster has fallen out of favor is really what it is. But you used to see its share of Bazaar Baghdad's whenever you'd see the Gitrog monster being played. It was usually always in there as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting, especially because like now I've played against some Gitrogs and I've seen, Dakmor, I've seen the Eldrazi Titans, sometimes Life from the Loam, stuff like that. But that's really interesting that this card has definitely kind of fallen out for those reasons. But I mean, I can definitely see its uses.
All right. What other cards do we have for Arabian Nights?
I think that's it. I think that's it, actually. You'll probably see, like a trend with these sets. It's early on, and so when it comes to just Commander in general, it's probably not going to be a ton. I'm just going to be honest with you.
Yeah. This was printed before Commander existed. Like Arabian Nights isn't going to be full of bangers. The reason that so many of these cards are so expensive is not because, oh my gosh, these are cards that need to be played in every single deck ever created ever. It's because there just wasn't many printed. Like they had print runs. I forget exactly which one this one is, so forgive me if I'm misquoting. Like they would print 10 to 15 million cards. That includes the commons and things like that. Like that's all cards. There's only like 10 to 15 million Arabian Nights that exist. And that's why they command such high prices. Like, for example, Bazaar of Baghdad, guess how many times that was printed in paper?
Probably like 2.
1.
Oh, well.
Ever. It was printed once ever. It was never printed in paper after that. Like, we'll get into reserve list conversations later on when the reserve list came to be, but it was only ever printed once. So you only can really get one copy of it. Yes, technically speaking, for all you pedantic viewers out there, it was technically printed twice in an oversized card that's like, like a 3.5 foot by 2 foot. You've got me there, but good luck shuffling that deck. Okay. So just get out of my face with that. But for all intents and purposes for your deck, it was only ever printed one time. And that's why things like these command such high prices. They're just super rare. That's all it really is.
Yeah. Yeah. Demand and how much you can get it definitely always going to command pricing. We're talking about, players being able to get certain cards, especially cards that they need. If you're saying, this was needed for Gitrog, and Gitrog is at the time one of the more powerful strategies in a format. Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be even harder to get, because now not only is it not printed as well, but now people need it to compete in these, tournaments and everything. So, yeah.
Yeah. And need is a strong word. We all know how budget options exist, and you don't need this to function. Of course, there's all that kind of stuff. But basically, yeah, it was a really, really powerful include in Gitrog.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so let's move on to our next set, the second Horsemen of the Apocalypse, Famine or something. I don't know. I don't know what the 4 Horsemen actually are.
Ric Flair, Tony Legend.
Oh, that was great. The second set we are talking about is Antiquities. Antiquities is the second expansion. This one had focused on a theme. It had an artifact focus. Every single card in Antiquities is either an artifact or mentions an artifact in its rules text. Every single one. Is the first set to feature multiple arts for the same card. Now, that was a thing they did for a little while back then. Then they kind of stopped unless it was like a special printing or something like that. And then with the, 30 years later, the Secret Lairs just said everything can have infinite arts. That's just how it is. But this was the very first set to feature that. Cards that were functionally exactly the same, had the same name, everything. Yeah, but they had different arts, and someone would have multiple on there. This was the first set to do that. Because of that, this was actually revered as a 100-card set because of the unique arts on some of these cards. Some of these would be a little bit more, ubiquitous today. Let me see if I can pull one up real quick here. But one of them, for example, that's what I was trying to find. It was Strip Mine and the Urza, the Tron lands. They had multiple printings back then. And so those cards were, this was the first time that was introduced. There was actually a buyback program where players could send up to 100 cards back to Wizards to receive cash back through it. It was interesting. That was like not something that they ever really did. However, that was part of the inspiration that led to some of the decisions through other things, which we won't get into, to the MTGO or the Moto redemption policy. If you collect one of every card on Magic the Gathering Online from an expansion, so let's say that Wilds of Eldraine was released, and you collected one of every single card in that, you could click on those cards, redeem them through Wizards of the Coast. They would take them out of your virtual inventory and literally send you a box of every single one of those cards real, which is really cool.
Yeah. Once when I first started playing MTGO and someone told me about that, I almost was like, oh, dude. I was like, yeah, I'm buying these online cards for it. And then I didn't. But that was really cool. Well,
yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool to see.
Because everyone was like, yeah, I'll game the system. I'll get these cards on MTGO for a fraction of their value and make unlimited money. That's not how it works, but it's a nice thought.
It is nice. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. We didn't want to spend tons of time like we did on Arabian Nights, where we don't want to spend all the time going over this stuff. But yeah, Antiquities is the second expansion. It was artifact based. It introduced a couple of interesting things. Had this interesting buyback program in it. It was also released in 1994.
Nice. Yeah, I definitely remember the multiple art things for the Tron lands messing me up really bad when I first got into like Modern, because I was going to play budget green Tron, and I was going through my LGS's like computer trying to buy that. I'm like, is there a difference between these? Do I need all of these? Like, God. So now I'm walking out with all these arts for like Urza's, and this was after they had been reprinted as well. So I'm like, I've got like 6 different Urza's mines. I don't know what to do with them. It was bad, but yeah. Antiquities is great.
Yeah, the multiple printings is a really cool thing, in my opinion. One of the things that is notable about some of those multiple printings is the idea that some of them were actually put into a different rarity slot. And the kind of the best example of this is Mishra's Factory. I think it's Mishra's Factory. Mishra's Factory, there was 4 seasons, and it was Mishra's Factory Winter is like the most expensive by like a Texas mile. Like it's hundreds of dollars. It's like one of the second most expensive cards in the entire Antiquities set. But it's just because they actually put it in a different rarity slot, which is a wild thought.
Yeah, that's really cool, and definitely really cool for collectors who want, those different arts and everything in their thing. Mm-hmm. I get that part. Yeah, 100%. I'm a sucker for pretty art. The card can be trash, but the art's nice. I'll try and find something for it.
I'll at least try and find it. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So you want to get into the cards now?
Yep. Go ahead. What is some of the cards for Antiquities? What do we see today?
The biggest one on our list right here is Transmute Artifact. This is a card you see a lot in today's meta, specifically because of decks like Tivit and Kinnan that really need these very specific artifacts to be on the board in order to combo off. Transmute allows you to do that very easily by just turning one of your mana rocks into the artifact itself. That's really great. And for 2 blue, it's really easy to do. Obviously, you have to pay the cost afterwards, but if you're going for like Time Sieve, usually it's free. Or after that, or if you're doing, Basalt Monolith, it's really easy to do as well. You can just do that. I know one of my favorite things to do is like Transmute Artifact on a 3-ball, probably like a Trinisphere or something like that. Once I've gotten everybody locked out, get the Basalt. And then you can do like a channel ability off of the Sky Turtle, get it back. It's really fun. So it's gotta love it.
What a game where you could talk about Transmute Artifact and Colossal Sky Turtle in the same paragraph.
It's so great. I love channel abilities. Oh my God. Are you going to do anything? You can't. Oh man. But yeah, Transmute Artifact is definitely one of the bigger cards that we see today. And then Power Artifact. We're having a trend here where the first card I'm like, yeah, duh. And then the second card I'm like, interesting. This is a card that I don't see as often these days, but I know, could definitely be seen. I think I've seen it outside of our format in like Affinity list and things of that nature. Do you have any idea of where this is seen? I do not actually now.
This used to see tons of play in CEDH. This was kind of one of those chase cards, kind of like Bazaar. It wasn't nearly to the crazy price that Bazaar was, because we're talking about like maybe a $250 card, which isn't cheap. I'm not trying to say it is, but compared to like $2,200 to $2,500 for like Bazaar, Power Artifact was definitely one of those cards that saw a lot of play to generate infinite mana. It was used a lot in Thrasios decks. And what you would do is you would put it onto a Grim Monolith or Basalt Monolith, generate infinite mana, and draw your deck with Thrasios. This fell out of favor. It's still played in some decks, especially like some blue decks like that are mono blue, but this fell out of favor with the printing of Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. Basically, this just let you already could do what you want to do with Basalt, and Kinnan already like kind of boosted everything else too. So like this wasn't enough anymore when you could just have Kinnan and get the same effect plus everything else that Kinnan provides by just putting Kinnan into the 99 instead of Power Artifact.
Interesting. That makes sense, because I've been playing since Kinnan has been printing, and so I've not seen Power Artifact really played in any of those lists, whether it be my Thrasio's list or anything else, and that makes sense. Yeah, it just is one of those cards that I could see getting power crept because of that, because it's on a creature. It's a lot easier to get with like green tutors. There's a lot of like green Sun Zenith, things like that get kitted out on the battlefield pretty easily, and then you can just combo off from there. So yeah, exactly. That makes sense. But definitely though, that seems good. I like infinite mana. I like making mana for things. You need mana to pay for things. I like paying for things. So yeah.
Yep. And Kennen was like $1.
That too,
this one was like 250, and they were like, why are we just playing Kennen now? So like this definitely had its heyday. It did see play. But like some other things in this list, previous and subsequent, it just got power crept or just got replaced by something better over the 30-year history of Magic.
Makes sense. It happens. That's how card games evolve.
Yep. And Transmute Artifact, I think what's unique about Transmute Artifact is that it actually tutors it directly onto the battlefield. And there's really not many of those. There's really not. There is Reshape. There is Transmute Artifact. There is things like Wargate. There's also Tinker, which is banned. It was so good it was banned. And like not many others. Whir of Invention is another. But
Tezzeret. Tezzeret the Seeker, stuff like that.
That's right. Yep. So, but if you'll notice, like, we're not talking about 100 here that do this. We're talking about like 10 that do this ever. And this is a really, really good one because it's low cost. You sacrifice the artifact on resolution, not as an additional casting cost. And there's a big distinction between those two, because if somebody counters Transmute Artifact, you don't have to sacrifice the artifact. So you're not down 2 cards if it gets countered. And so it's really powerful in that aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. And compared to the other cards that we were talking about that do the same thing of getting it directly on the battlefield, Tezzeret the Seeker is like 5. Whir of Invention, you have to pay the cost of whatever it is on top of the pips for war, and even then it still can get countered. It's really difficult to mess around with Transmute. Like there's not necessarily as much of a negative with Transmute as opposed to a lot of the other cards that we were talking about. So
yeah, because Whir is 3 pips, right? And so Whir of Invention's three blue pips plus blue. I'm sorry, plus X. And it has Improvise, and we won't get into all the details. The other one is Reshape, and you have to sacrifice an artifact as an additional cost. So that's another, that was like, if somebody counters your Reshape, you're still out the artifact. If somebody counters your Transmute, you're not out the artifact. That's the distinction there. Before we get into the next one, there is one little piece of Antiquities trivia that I've always personally liked. This is nothing to do with CEDH. There's 1,000 cool things about Antiquities in all of these sets. But one thing that has always stuck out to me was how cards get inspired for things later on. Like the original printing of something can inspire something that happens much later. The reason that this one kind of inspired me so much, or why I like it so much, I should say, is because of, obviously, I really love Godo Bandit Warlord and its combo piece, Helm of the Host. Helm of the Host is an equipment. Equipments came around in Mirrodin. All the way back in Mirrodin, so like it was way, way later than Antiquities. So why do I care about it? And that's because there are 2 cards in the Antiquities set that was the inspiration for the creation of equipment. And that was Ashnod's battle gear and Tanos's weaponry. And basically what they are is they're artifacts that you can tap them, and you can choose not to untap them during your untap step. So as long as they were tapped, they gave like a buff to a creature or whatever. And that was basically like, hey, I'm equipping like a sword or a weapon to you. And that's what inspired the later invention of the equipment type for artifacts. And I've always thought that was so cool that it was all the way back in Antiquities, the inspiration for that. They took all the way to Mirrodin some like 15 years later.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. Not 15 years later. I apologize. It's like 5, 6, 7, 8 years later. My bad.
That's super neat though. Yeah. Especially because, equipment at this point has taken on a mind of its own with like, its own card type. People love equipment strategies, and to know that something, one of those 2 cards were able to really, push the designers in a way of like, hey, there's actually something here that we can move towards in that direction. That's really cool to see.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Card Conduit. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. Don't waste hours trying to find the best buy list price for your cards online. Simply send them to Card Conduit and let them take care of the rest. I've used Card Conduit multiple times already. I always use them to get the best value of my extra cards. I get fair prices for my cards and they save me tons of time. They have 3 main services. Their standard service lets you send them unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best buy list price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half of the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their new sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. They give you the best price for your cards. They work with competitive buy listing partners, including ones not open to the public. Users get an average of 19% more for their collection than they would have from a major retail buy list, even with Card Conduit's fees. Card Conduit also optimizes buy listing for card condition as well. Since vendors have different penalties for wear and tear, Card Conduit will find the best buy list price against the specific condition of a card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the show notes or the description, or use the promo code POWER, you'll also get 10% off their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's podcast.
Okay, let's get into our third set, which is Legends. This is the third expansion set. It's not part of any block, just like the previous 2 were not. It was a bigger expansion. Like the first were like 190 and stuff like that. This one had 310 cards in it. So this one was like no joke. It was beefy. This was the first set to have booster packs of 15 cards. For those of you who don't know, the early sets only had 8. When you bought a pack of Magic, it contained 8 cards. This is the first one that actually introduced 15 cards. This was the first one to introduce, you guessed it, legendary permanents. That's why it's called Legends. They were supposed to denote notable characters in the story, which we see to this day. This was when the legend rule was introduced. Basically, how can you have a hero, it has a very unique story and stuff like that, when you could have 4 of them in a deck. So they introduced the legend rule. They obviously had legendary creatures, but they also had legendary lands. So there were legendary permanents that were introduced in here. But the legend rule was introduced that basically said, as long as it was on the battlefield, you couldn't play or cast it. That was the OG legend rule. It has gone through a couple of iterations since then. But the original one basically said, if you had the legend if there was a legend on the battlefield, no one else could cast it. Not cast it and then choose and do this, that, and the other. It was you could not cast it. As far as the permanents go, I believe that if once it was on the battlefield, you had to choose one and then it went away. And then there was a couple of other legend things that came on later. We won't go over all the details, but basically it became like when 2 were on the battlefield, you could still cast it, but once they hit the battlefield, they both went away, and then you could choose one again, and then it became each player could control their own, but they couldn't control multiples. Legend rules had a lot of changes over the years, but the OG legend rule says if it was on the battlefield, you couldn't cast something of the same name of it. And if it was a land, I believe you had to choose one and it had to go away. It had enchant worlds. The ideas of enchant worlds or worldly enchantments was kind of the early concept of planes. This is something that had a global effect. And it also had a pseudo legendary kind of feel to it because you could only have one enchant world at a time on the battlefield. So a quick example of this is a card that some people may have seen in casual Magic or, some CEDH things. I won't say whether or not this ends up on the list or not, is Concordant Crossroads. Concordant Crossroads is a world enchantment. It's not an enchantment, it's a world enchantment. World is a super type, just like legendary and things like that. There can only be one world enchantment on the battlefield at a time. Okay. So if a new world enchantment happens, basically, I believe that the other ones get destroyed, and the rules might have changed since then because it's this kind of pseudo to the legend rule, and it's gone through a couple of iterations as well. But basically, if if a world, I'll just read it. When a world permanent enters the battlefield, any world permanents that were already on the battlefield are put into their owner's graveyards. Okay. This is a state-based action called the world rule. The new world permanent stays on the battlefield. If two world permanents enter the battlefield at the same time, they're both put into their owner's graveyards. So basically, whenever you cast a world enchantment, the other one goes away, and that becomes the new world enchantment. So there was a couple of different world enchantments that were around at the time, and most of them have fallen away. And so seeing things like Concordant Crossroads, for example, and it sees this world enchantment, it's not very common anymore. They've pretty much abandoned that. But that was the kind of the early concept of planes, like this is the plane we're on and stuff like that. Another thing that was introduced at that time was poison and poison counters. If a player receives 10 or more poison counters, they lose the game. We saw this in the early iterations inside of Legends, but then that was later touched on again in Mirrodin, or Scars of Mirrodin block, I should say more specifically, with the introduction of Infect. And then when we came back to Mirrodin, or I guess Phyrexia, if you will, they came up with a concept of toxic. So if something has toxic 1, 2, or 3, no matter what damage you got dealt, you would receive also that many poison counters. So poison counters were originally introduced in Legend. There's a couple other interesting things about counters in it, is that some of the weird ways they did old rulings and some of the weird ways that they used to do Magic didn't really work when they kind of came up with a 6th edition rule changes and then further errata rule changes over the years. And so they had to do some like funky erratas to make things work. And some of the things that they did was counters to kind of account for certain things, especially if something had like an X in its mana cost. And you'll see like weird different counter types, and a lot of those are in this set. So whenever you look at the errata of an old card, it might say, you know, oh, this enters with so-and-so scream counters on it and things like that. And you're like, what's a scream counter? What's this, that, or the other counter? And they had to kind of make that stuff work by just saying so-and-so enters with X of whatever counter on it. And that's how they made it work with the current changes. So yeah, Legends, what a set. And then there's one last thing that we want to say about Legends. We wouldn't have Commander without Legends. Because Commander and the legendary, creature is what gave birth to the idea of Elder Dragon Highlander. Elder Dragons were released in this set. Whether or not they're on this CDH thing is something else to be discussed. But Nicobolas and Arcades and stuff like that, they were Elder Dragons. They were 3-color Elder Dragons. And those were some of the original cards that were used in the inception of the Commander format. The Elder Dragons were what were at the helm. They were in the command zone before it was called that. And that's what was used to help create the format. Elder Dragon Highlander.
Next time you drink some brews and play on Friday Night Magic, you better thank your grandpappy Nicol Bolas.
That's right. Your grandpappy. That's right.
Because the first card art is just him sitting with a book, and I'm like, oh man, look at this distinguished gentleman. Look at him. Look at him go.
He's quite the dapper chap. Oh, look at him.
What is he doing? What is he plotting? Who knows? Oh, yeah. No,
yep, this was the first set. Yep. This was the first set to introduce multicolored. That's another thing, so that's very interesting. Yep.
Yeah. Nice. Nice. It also had some gas. I'm not going to lie. I was looking at a lot of these cards and I'm like, yeah, hold on. This is the one they cooked on. And it makes sense, with the set that brought in like legendary creatures. It definitely makes sense that we are getting some cards that are actually good in Commander. Otherwise, that'd be very sad. Some of the cards that we were discussing that are still played from the set today. Big ones like Mana Drain. Mana Drain is huge tempo swing for any deck that utilizes counters, counter magic. You pay 2 pips, it counters any target spell, so it's one of those hard counters. So things like Dockside, I don't know why you would waste a Mana Drain on Dockside, but you could get rid of it. It could go. Glinthorn Buccaneer, that's a really big target for me. I'm like, 3 mana to make it so that doesn't happen? Sure. But it's mainly used now to like counter really big spells and then allow you to have that tempo swing on your turn with all the mana that you get from it to start comboing off instead. I see it It's played in just about any deck that can utilize the 2 blue pips. I think that's the only reason people don't utilize it as much, is just because you do need 2 blue specifically. But I mean, if you're playing blue anyways, at some point, hopefully you have 2 islands on the battlefield, 2 blue lands, or some sort of talisman or anything that taps for blue, hopefully. So yeah, it's definitely a card that sees play a ton. And then the other one that we were talking about is Sylvan Library. Green often gets a lot of hate in today's meta, just because it's like, oh, well, whatever. But Sylvan Library is one of those cards that still is a staple to this day, despite what you think. It is a huge tempo swing for green to be able to keep on pace with other decks that are doing all of these really big draw things and everything. Okay, cool. I have dorks. Now I can convert some card draw as well. Yeah, you're burning through your life, with taking 8 each time if you're trying to keep all 3 cards. But I mean, still 3 cards every draw step versus the 1. At some point, I'm going to be able to, even if that resolves just once, at some point, I'm going to be able to go for some kind of combo win. So yeah, those are the 2 biggest cards from the set that I think see play in this meta that we talked about earlier. For good reason. Yeah, they're pretty cracked.
Yeah, the drop off wasn't nearly as bad in this one. And a lot of people are like, whenever they look at mana drain, because it's not on the reserve list, so it sees printings to this day. We've seen it in multiple sets. And a lot of people look at this card and they're like, why would they print Counterspell with strict upside? Why would they do that and not increase its pips or its cost or whatever? Why in the world would that happen? Mana drain used to be a worse Counterspell. Mana drain used to add colorless to your pool equivalent to the amount that you count of the cost of the spell at your beginning of your next main phase. The thing is that a thing called mana burn used to exist. Do you know what this is, TK? Mana burn?
Yeah, I did hear.
Okay.
I have never encountered it, but it is something that I've heard about, and with Kinnan scares the living mess out of me. I know.
it's a long forgotten thing, because it's been way out of favor for it's been like 15 years now since it's no longer been around, maybe even more. But basically the way that the old rules used to work was that, hey, if there was mana in your pool when you wanted to move to another phase, all that mana would empty for your pool, and you would take 1 damage for every mana that was in your pool. So this was a strictly worse counterspell if you couldn't utilize that mana. Sure, you could ramp, and sure, you could do something with it if you wanted to, but if you couldn't use it, you were going to burn yourself for it. So you tried to counter somebody's 8-drop dragon. Yeah, you got rid of their dragon, and then you took 6 on your next main phase because you couldn't utilize the colorless mana. So that was how it was a downside. But when they got rid of mana burn, this just became better counterspell. There was never a reason to ever run counterspell again. Like, it was just better in every single way. And that's something that, just through no actual changes to the cards themselves, just how rules of changes in the game has changed, has made this card really, really good. And the idea that, 2 blue pips is a little bit much to demand is actually kind of wild even nowadays. So.
Yeah, it's crazy to think that, all you have to do is pay 2 blue, and it's a really great counterspell with upside, like you were saying. And for some people, that's like, I don't want to do all that. And it's like, dude, I don't know, man. I think I'm going to pay the 2.
I'm not sure why people don't run this card. I think it's a fantastic card. I'm not... I understand 4-color mana bases, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I get that. I understand the arguments, but I'm like, have you played with the card? Or are you just looking at it in your Moxfield play tester and not seeing its value and forgetting to actually play the game? Because this card is absolutely amazing. And it's well, I don't have anything to sink it into. You don't have anything to sink 4 colorless into? What are you playing? what do you I'm sorry, you counter turn 2, then counter, and then on turn 3 you cast your Thrasios and immediately activate it with your free 4 colorless. I don't know. Then there's no downside either, because like I said, it's a strictly better counterspell. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be so cynical about it, but I think it's one of the best counterspells printed ever. Quite frankly, it's up there.
And it's interesting that was retroactive, right? Because like you were saying, Counterspell, the card was better than this on printing, but now you have Mana Burn Mana burn is a strategy now with certain commanders that have mana burn kind of attached to. I can't even think of the card now, but
yeah, there was one in Commander Legends, and it was basically saying we're going to bring back mana burn for this legend and kind of make people manage their resources more wisely and stuff like that, because that was kind of a long forgotten part of Magic.
Yeah. So that's really interesting that, change the rules, and now it's all the way flipped on its head, because I don't know anybody who would play Counterspell over this now.
Yeah. I mean, many people have cut Counterspell in favor of just Mana Drain, and I think that's the right choice.
Yeah, 100%.
All right. So let's move on to the next one. This one is called The Dark. This was contains 119 unique cards. There's really not a lot to say about this one, to be 100% honest with you. It had things like a Goblin tribal theme. It had really powerful abilities with things like intense colored mana and upkeep costs. Like you had to pay like 4 so-and-so, or else it does like 8 damage to you or whatever, or something like that. But like, this is an underpowered set. Like, this was when they were starting to stumble in this release cycle, because this was all released within 1 year. These 4 Horsemen sets, they were all released in 1994, and I think they were kind of struggling with this, and this was kind of a consequence of that. They were one of the things that happened was like, they were printing too much of it, and it didn't have the same power level comparable to the previous 3. There wasn't a whole lot of really advantageous cards that were being used. It introduced a theme and a story, which was nice, but like, it kind of fell flat because of it. And I think it's because they were really feeling the fatigue from these sets. Remember what I said, the first 3, Arabian Nights, Antiquities, and Legends, like first 2 had like 100 in each set, but the third one, like, it had like 300 in it. It had over 300, and then they had to print another 120 card set right after that. And I think that's when they just really kind of started to trip on their feet a little bit. There's not a whole lot else. This set did not do well, is the best way I can really put it. It didn't sell well. It didn't do well. It is an underperforming set. There's not a whole lot of cards that have tons of value in it. There's not to say there isn't, cards that aren't pricey in this, especially since some of these are on a reserve list. But this set didn't have the impact that the first 3 had.
Yeah. And that can be seen for sure in some of these cards that we were looking through. Don't get me wrong, there are some cards that do see play in this format that are very much, like, really much tied to this format at this point that we'll get into. But outside of those cards, it's not a lot going on. Like, the Goblin, I guess if you play, what's his name? The red guy, 10 Street King, can't think of his name.
Oh, Krenko? 10 Street Kingpin?
Yeah. I mean,
this set does have Goblin Wizard in it. That's what a lot of people from casual EDH and just regular Commander look at and kind of see as the notable card that they would play from most casual circles. I mean, that card's not cheap. It's like a $50 card, but like Shield of the Apocalypse is worth more than a Goblin Wizard. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like,
I will say this set does have beautiful art. That's just a personal thing of me looking through some of this. I'm like, oh, wow. I think the art slaps hard. But some of the cards that are associated with those arts is not necessarily holding that much value.
Yeah, exactly. And like, there's only like 1 or 2 other little tiny little things about it. But that's, on the whole, there's not really a whole lot to say, except for one other thing, which is that this was one of the sets that really kind of broke the concept of the color pie, like today's ideas of it. Like, you had blue land destructions and white direct damage and red targeted creature destruction, which it never does that normally. White toughness reduction and mass land destruction, on and on and on. But it had a lot of color pie breaks in it to what were traditionally, up until that point, kind of considered what the color pie strengths and weaknesses were. And this set did break a lot of them.
Yeah. And I think that could be attributed to, like you said, there was a fatigue with trying to design these cards. They were trying something new, probably with those things. And it just, for the person who is like, no, white doesn't do that. It does not and probably should not. And
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Except for like apparently green and blue. They're just allowed to do whatever they want nowadays.
Old Nabo
I'm not bitter. You're bitter.
I'm not bitter. You're bitter. And green got wild. And I haven't been okay since. I'm not okay. Yeah.
It's like, well, yeah, sure. Just give it that too. Why not? Yeah. I mean, might as well. You know, you've given green everything else. Why not do that too? Sell sets. Green sells commander product. That's all I gotta say. Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the cards from the dark that we see.
Absolutely. So there are 3 cards here that we were talking about that see a lot of play here. The first one is really good. It's Felwar Stone. Pretty much in most cases, it's an arcane signet for your deck. Most cases. Very rarely does this card not tap for all of the colors in your color pool when you sit down at a pod. So yeah, if you're playing rocks, it's easy to just, 2. If you're playing Arcane Signet, you're going to play Felwar Stone too. I don't see a world in which you're not playing both. Absolutely. I don't think there's much else that needs to be said there.
What can't you say about Felwar Stone? It's a bad turn 1 rock going first, I guess. Yeah,
sure. Somebody's gonna have to play mana at some point. Like, even if I play it turn 1, you're gonna turn it on at some point. It's fine. Then there's Elves of Deep Shadow. It's one of those weird dorks that you pay. It's like Avacyn's Pilgrim, but for black you pay it, but it also pings you for 1, if I'm not mistaken. Which is fine. That's a very, very black thing to do. In terms of like the color buy and everything, with losing damage and everything, losing life rather. But yeah, it'll see play in anything that has like Golgari, in its colors. I know I played it in like Grist and other decks like that. If you're trying to ramp up for mana, makes sense. And then finally we have Blood Moon. My opinion, the best red stacks piece ever printed, next to Magus of the Moon that just does the exact same thing. It's every time. If you're not playing, if it wasn't for Dockside Extortionist, this card would be, I'd cry every time it would hit the board, simply because I don't know how I'm gonna get out of that. Now I'm just gonna sit there and look at these cards, especially because red, outside of like before Dockside, was not necessarily seen as kind of this huge, the color that it is now today in our format. Dockside, Ragavan, a lot of those cards really upped the ante for colors like that. So somebody playing, like you're playing Godo, if you drop Blood Moon, there's nothing I can do. I can float mana in response and hope that I have something, and that's it. That's all I got. So yeah, definitely a card that has seen play tons and tons. I know it's seen play, like I said, in certain Godo lists, certain Kalia list. I played this as well because you get Kalia out and then everybody can't play spells. Cool. Now everybody just gets hit over and over again in their face, and great, I win. Yeah. Those are the 3 cards that we were talking about from the dark. Makes complete sense to me.
Yep. Blood Moon is an interesting one because I would argue that Blood Moon is still very strong. I think that there's definitely arguments to be said about how Dockside has nerfed the Blood Moon effects and you're giving them the red pip to cast the Dockside and blah, 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 blah. Come on. Like, that doesn't mean that just because Dockside got printed means, Blood Moon became nothing. It's still a very powerful effect. Winota still runs it and loves to see a flip into it. They love to flip into a Magus of the Moon. And if you loved it so much with the prevalence of Dockside, why is it still in there? Right. It's an amazing card. Like, these Blood Moon effects are really, really powerful. I'm not saying that it should be the top number 1 of everything ever. I'm not saying that. I am saying that it does actually still have a lot of strength. And I think what also caused it to fall out of favor over the years wasn't necessarily the fact that Dockside was printed, because that was a factor, but it was also because a lot of these lists that were running red were nerfing their own lands just as much. And a lot of them really couldn't afford to do that because a lot of the places where you see Dockside is in every deck with red, don't get me wrong, but you also see it in every 4-color deck that has red too. So to have something like a Blood Moon effect have this kind of like, oh, I'm hurting, my Ancient Tomb doesn't work anymore, my City of Traders doesn't tap for 2, and all these other things that I'm trying to lean on with the strengths of speed of something like piggyback off of Blood Moon, I don't get that anymore. And so as such, I think it's just fallen out of favor, and I think that's a shame. I think it's a good card.
Absolutely. I agree. And like to the Dockside point, it's one card out of the other 99 that you have to get to. So yeah, of course, if I happen to
every creature tutor's also a Dockside, but yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's true. But most creature tutors we're thinking of are like green, and all your lands tap for red. It's a lot harder.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. 100%.
All right. And we wanted to talk about 2 more sets while we were here. And why are we doing that? Because these are these weird sets that don't really kind of belong anywhere. And there is another reason why we're bringing them up. And, spoiler alert, they sucked. They were really bad.
Basura.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So they were Fallen Empires and Homelands. And these 2 sets, we don't want to touch on very long. But basically, there was a couple of quick things about them. So, Fallen Empires had 187 cards, including the unique arts and unique flavor text from a collector's perspective. You could say there's about 187 cards in here. It was the last set to use the tilted T tap symbol. If you look at early revised, like a lot of people that have dual lands have revised dual lands. And when it has the tap symbol, it has the slanted T tap. And then they finally replaced that with their actual tap symbol that they use to this day. So this was the last set to do it. A very important thing about Fallen Empires as well was it changed how Magic was produced forever. Fallen Empires was overproduced. Part of the reason that you can get Fallen Empires for so unbelievably cheap nowadays, like you could buy the whole set, I think, for under $50 or something like that. And it was because there was over 350 million cards printed. This is where we saw the full effect of their stumbling from 1994 into 1995. Homelands and Fallen Empires was printed in 1995. And Fallen Empires was really overproduced because they were like, oh, these previous sets we printed like, we printed like 20 million of them or 10 million of them or maybe even 50 million of them, and they just ripped off the shelves. We couldn't keep them in stock. It was crazy. And so as they were gearing up for their 1995 sets, they printed like 350 million of the Fallen Empires cards. And this was a huge financial loss for Wizards at the time. And I'm not sure if it actually would have, I don't know if it was actually put them in dire straits or not, but it was kind of recorded like, hey, this was a big hit for Wizards. And that led to the creation of their sales team kind of controlling the market through strategized scarcity. Essentially, they were not going to just print ahead of time and just everything was going to get thrown out there. They were actually going to start to regulate and control how product was distributed, who was going to get the product, how many boxes people were going to get, what kind of store were you, denoted what quantity of product you get. Were you just a hobby shop that, sold RC planes and, like electronics and just happened to have a little corner in your booth next to your cash register with a box of Magic on it? You weren't going to get as much Magic product because they were just kind of blanket sending it out to anybody who would do it. Versus the LGS, who had card tables and dedicated themselves to TCGs, and they would get more. And then later on, that led to inception of things like WP and premium stores and all that kind of stuff. But Fallen Empires was kind of the first hard-learned lesson in that step towards that. But basically, if it wasn't for the overprinting and the financial hit of Fallen Empires, we may not have had this controlled distribution of product today.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And then one quick touch on Homelands. Homelands is a very similar story. It's not the exact same, but it's something very similar to it. And one little factoid about Homelands is that it used to be a expansion in Ice Age, which is interesting, but it was actually retroactively separated from the block. And then later on, like Cold Snap was the kind of conclusion of that. But we'll get into that into our Ice Age episode in the future. But it's actually kind of like like kind of retroactively said, nope, that's no longer part of that block anymore. It's it was, now it's not. That's just not how we're doing it.
Scoot over.
Just trust us on this one. It's better this way. It's better this way.
Promise.
You let this happen. Let this happen.
That's funny.
But the short answer is these sets weren't very good. So with that being said, let's start with Fallen Empires and Homeland. What are some CEDH cards
from Fallen Empires? Yeah,
nothing. Not a single card. We don't see a single card from Fallen Empires. Not one.
Can't. And there's probably going to be somebody in the comments that's like, "Oh no, I play this whatever in my whatever deck. I don't care about that. That's not. That's not.
I do care. Please God, tell us which one it is. Tell us what you play. We don't see these cards anywhere.
No, yeah, no, nowhere to be found. Nowhere to be seen. Homelands is very similar. There's just one card only, and even that card is kind of a stretch at these days. It's Merchant Scroll. You'll see it in blue center decks that are really trying to get to certain, spells. But other than that, that's about it. And even that is, there's so many other ways to tutor, especially if you're in multiple colors. If you're in blue-black, you're usually going to lean on your black tutors more than anything because those will get them directly into your hand and they can search anything. But if you're in, blue-centered decks that don't necessarily have that luxury, then yeah, Merchant Scroll will see play there.
Yeah.
But other than that, that's it.
Yeah, because it's a sorcery that searches for an instant. It's not an instant that searches for an instant. So you have to search for a blue instant. So yeah, there's a couple of win cons you can grab, or you maybe grab some counter magic to protect your win or whatever. But it's not that,
Not
so
much.
out of two sets,
yeah,
we found one card.
I think the only card I can think of, the only deck right now that I can think of off the top of my head that uses Merchant Scroll like crazily is Tatiova, because they need whatever the card is that blinks the ghostly flicker.
And it also gets Nexus of Fate. Yeah, it does that too.
Yeah,
but it's like, yeah, we can pick this stuff apart all we want. Oh, some decks play High Tide. Yeah, not any that I see, but some do. But like, for example, my Godo deck does play Dwarven Ruins because you can sack it to add 2 red. Right? Okay. We're the only one. we're the only deck that runs it. It's such a niche application that it hardly warrants itself to be considered a CEDH staple or whatever, if you will. It's a very edge case. Like Magda has a bunch of stuff like that. These random one-off dwarves, it only plays well because it's Magda. Like it doesn't necessarily warrant itself to be included. But if we missed one in Fallen Empires or Homelands, please comment and let us know where we clearly overlooked, because we couldn't find only one in both sets. They were not good.
I will be reading. I'm super excited to see what people say. Jokes or not. And people are like, no, I play this and whatever. It's fine. Please comment it. That'll be the highlight
let us
of my
know.
day. But yeah. So those are the 4 Horsemen sets. Those are the cards that really kind of define our format right now that we see. Any final thoughts, Ryan, before we kind of move on to the next sets moving forward?
These sets, what I loved about these old sets was that you can see how they help define what Magic is today. You see things that were introduced in it that we see to this day. And it's also cool as a snapshot back in time as well of things like old rulings and how certain things worked. The ideas, just like we had talked about in a previous episode, and the ideas of these old rules and what they become new rules. When I talked about things like the equipment, like the inspiration for that stuff, I love that kind of stuff. I love seeing how these types of things become those things over the years. And I think that kind of stuff is a really cool part of the history of this game. I love that we still play with some of these cards to this day. There isn't a bunch in these sets. Honestly, thank God, because some of this stuff is so expensive, it's unbelievable. I'm glad we don't see them, quite frankly. But I think it is neat that, you sit down and turn 1, I play a City of Brass, and that was a card played in 1994. I think that's a cool thought.
Yeah, Absolutely. I think it's so sick. It's the reason why I've been enjoying like other formats like pre-modern and stuff like that, because I love seeing these older cards that, you know, maybe have fallen out of favor, maybe are not seen anymore. But it's that kind of history that's associated with it. It's the reason why we're doing even these episodes, is because it's so fascinating to look at back and see kind of not only how far the game has come in like its 30 plus years of being around, but also seeing how this format has developed and where all of these things are coming from. Because I bet money most people who are like me have been playing with these cards and didn't even know the history, you know, of Arabian Nights and all of these other sets and kind of where these things came from. We just kind of jumped in and, you know, associated things with the format, and so it was. And so it's always really interesting to kind of see where these cards come from and how far the game has grown. It's grown a lot. Yeah. Well, with that, I will say to the listeners, we do have a question for you, as we do every episode. Please tell us your favorite Four Horsemen memory. It can be either while you were playing that time or with cards from that set. Just let us know. And also definitely don't forget to let us know if you play anything from Fallen Empires. Definitely want to know about that. But in addition to, let us know your favorite Four Horsemen memory. If you played during that time, definitely I want to hear all of the great stories that you have. And yeah, that is it for this episode. Make sure to give us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast aggregator. You'd be surprised at how much it helps us out. You can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and more. All of the links are in the episode notes or the description below. And yeah, that wraps it up for this episode of the podcast. Tune in next time when we talk more about our favorite format and our favorite game, Magic the Gathering. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and we will see you next time. Take care, guys.